Well, my friends, 2020 was the year I decided I was going to be a gardener. I got raised beds, I filled them with good choice soil, I got nice seeds, I planted them inside so I would have seedlings to put outside when time came right, and I cultivated this garden, and I prayed over this garden, and I worked in this garden and for this garden, and I planted everything when the time came right, and I had pepper plants and tomato plants and broccoli and cauliflower and spinach and cucumbers and peas and a whole bunch of other things that were beautiful and green and growing. And they didn't give me anything. So I fertilized them, and I cultivated, and I cared for them, and I pruned the branches that didn't produce any fruit, and I prayed for them, and I worked with them, and I pulled the weeds from around them so they'd be able to get all the nutrients they needed. And they gave me a little bit, but pretty much nothing. And so I was very happy on the day I got to pull all those fruitless vines out of the dirt and put them in my compost pile. And then 2021, I was going to be a gardener. And I did the same thing. Except this time I prepared the garden a little more. I got some composted mulch, and I filtered it in and prepared the soil beds a little bit more, and I turned them all over, and I prepared, and I planted. And I had very green plants and very few peppers and tomatoes and all the other things that I really wanted to eat. So if I wanted them, I had to go to the grocery store. And the catharsis of pulling those out and putting them into the compost pile was present as well. And this year, I didn't even bother planting a garden. Whatever grows, grows. And that, my friends, is an illustration of what it was like for God also with the people Israel. Several times throughout the Old Testament, you read of God as the vine grower or the gardener. And the way the story goes is something like this. God prepared a place, cleared the ground of all the things that would prevent his plants from growing, and he built a wall around his vineyard. And then he went down to Egypt and plucked a choice vine and brought it to the promised land, his garden, and he planted that vine. And he cared for that vine, and he fertilized that vine, and he pruned that vine so that it would bear much fruit. But all it did was produce wild fruit, not the kind of fruit he had cultivated it to bear. And so he knocked down the walls and let the animals trample over that vine. Animals known as Assyria and Babylon. And they carried that vine to another land where it would lay dormant. And eventually, from the stump of Jesse, a new shoot would come up. And it would bear much fruit. And if you want to hear that story, it comes over and over again to us in the Old Testament. You can read about it in Psalm 80 and Jeremiah 2. You can read about it in 3 different places of Ezekiel, chapters 15, 17, and 19. And you can read about it in Isaiah chapter 5. And in each of those stories, each of those tellings, the story is the same. God prepared a place where growth could happen, where fruit could be nurtured and produced, and the world would be different because that vine would grow and it would produce branches, and they would go out into all of the world and they would transform the world by introducing God's justice and goodness to all of the world. And I want to read for you Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7. You can read it because it'll be on the screens. It tells of why this vine was so important to the people. Never mind, it's not on the screens. I'm going to have to get my Bible. So just a bit of confession. This morning has been a comedy of errors. Because whenever you try to do things for God, Murphy likes to play all over the place. So hear these words from Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. So did you hear that? I'm going to finish reading in a second, but do you hear that? Isaiah is telling us what God's people are. We, God's people, Israel and Judah, are the planting of Israel. God planted them in a land that they would bear much fruit. And now Isaiah is going to tell us what kind of fruit God intended and what kind of fruit God got from his garden. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed. Righteousness, but heard a cry. Now I realize that sounds a little odd to us. I'm about to make it sound even more odd because I'm going to tell you what those words are in Hebrew. You know, usually I'm the pastor who talks about Greek. Today I'm the pastor who talks about Hebrew. So the words in that passage that get translated as justice and bloodshed are mishpat and no mishpat. And then the words that get translated as righteousness and heard a cry are zedek and no zedek. What Isaiah is telling the people of God in this is that God wanted justice from you and got no justice. God wanted righteousness from you and got no righteousness. Brothers and sisters, this is the fruit that the people of God were intended to bear. And they didn't. The wild grapes were no justice and evil, or no righteousness, no goodness. And because of that, God knocked the walls down around his garden, and Assyria and Babylon trampled it. But Isaiah goes on later in his prophecies to talk about the stump of Jesse. Jesse was the father of David, and from David's lineage, a new shoot would come up. A new plant, new growth out of old roots. We talk about that new shoot as Jesus. Oftentimes that scripture passage from Isaiah about the stump from Jesse gets read during Advent. You hear it around that Christmas time. And that's because Jesus became something that Israel was always meant to be. And John, you hear about this over and over and over again. John begins his story of Jesus that we call gospel, the good news about Jesus. He begins it by talking about, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he tells us that over and over and over again about how Jesus is the Word and Jesus is God. And he does that through these statements that we are doing a sermon series on. And they begin with these two words behind me. I am. Whenever those words show up in Jesus' mouth in the Gospel of John, John is telling us that Jesus is the divine creator present with us. I am was how God introduced himself to Moses. When Moses said, "Who will I say to the Israelites as sending me?" And God says, "I am, therefore I am." And so when John is telling the story about Jesus and who Jesus is, he has these words and he makes a point of saying them 7 times, and 7 is a holy number that should always point us to God when we read it in Scripture. I am, Jesus says. God present with you. And so in this passage, in John chapter 15, Jesus says, I am the true vine. What John is communicating to us about Jesus is that Jesus is not only the divine Son of God, but he is the true Israel. Because the vine was always meant to be Israel, and Israel failed every single time to be whom God created them to be. And so a new shoot from the stump of Jesse, one that was true, one that was holy, one that would be what Israel was always meant to be, came. and dwelt among us, and showed us what it is to bear fruit of justice and righteousness in this world. And so the context of this passage breathes new life into it for us to hear from John's gospel. Jesus is saying, I'm the true vine. I am what Israel was always meant to be. Israel was meant to be a kingdom of priests. You read that in Exodus 19, and you read it again in 2 Peter. Israel was always meant to communicate God's presence into a world who needed it so badly. And so when Israel failed, Jesus came and did that for us. Jesus came and dwelt among us, was the true vine, is the true vine, and always will be. And branches connected to Jesus, branched out into the whole world that the world might be transformed. I want you to hear this and see this image in the context it's meant to be in. Israel, formerly known as Jacob, had 12 branches, 12 sons. Jesus, the true vine, the true Israel, had 12 disciples. And I put that in quotes because we use 12 symbolically here because he had a lot more than 12 disciples. The men who wrote it just didn't talk about the women who were with him. Jesus had 12 disciples and is the true Israel, the branches of whom branched out into the world and bore much fruit for justice and righteousness, for mishpat and zedek. Mishpat being the justice for those where justice is not had. Zedek being righteousness, not holiness necessarily, but righteousness, goodness, in places where goodness needs to be had. These are the fruit of the people of God that demonstrate how connected we are to that vine when we do the work. That's what this passage is about. That's what John is trying to communicate to us through Jesus' words. That we are the branches grafted into the vine so that we may bear much fruit. And the life that flows through the Son of our Creator flows into us and through us that we may bear much fruit to the degree that we are connected to Him. In our English translations, that word as, A-S, is often there. But in the Greek, what it's telling us is to the degree that we are connected. To the degree that we are connected to the one who gives life and produces fruit of justice and righteousness in this world, we too will bear much justice and righteousness. That's what's being told to us in this passage. Because Jesus changes everything. The true Israel, fulfilling its purpose, changes everything in this world. John Ortberg, in his book, Who is This Man?, talks about the impact of Jesus on this world. I love this book because he points to all the different ways in our society that we know and that we often ignore that are transformed because Jesus lived. And those 12 branches went out into the world and bore much fruit and continue to bear much fruit. Because of Jesus, we value children enough to build schools and to educate them, to provide education for anybody and everybody. We may not always do a good job of it, but we do it. We try. And that's really the nature of the whole story of God's people, isn't it? We have good stuff that we try, and some stuff that we do the opposite of. But that's a whole different sermon. Because of Jesus, we have schools. Because of Jesus, we have hospitals. We value people to care for them and bring them into wholeness and healing. We've perverted that a little bit by making them profitable, but the point is healing and wholeness. We have hostels and homeless shelters because we value people's dignity and believe that they deserve a place to sleep where they can be warm and have a roof over their heads. We have things like hospice that care for people at the end of life and give them dignity as they near the end. We have places like orphanages and foster care facilities where we can provide dignity for children who have no one to care for them because we care for them because Jesus cared for them. There are so many different things that we do because Jesus is among us. And we bear the fruit of justice and righteousness as we are connected to him. Friends, justice is done in this world, and injustice is fought against always, and should be always, by the people of God. Because that is the fruit of our connection to our Creator, by the true vine, the true Israel, Jesus. The Quakers were one of the first groups to speak out against slavery in our country. And it's because of them and the anti-slavery movement that grew out of them and through them that we decided that slaves were fully human and should be given dignity and respect and not be enslaved in our country anymore. We fought a war over that. It's because of people like Dorothy Day and the Catholic Workers Movement that we believe that children should be able to go to school and not have to work for wages. And that people should make a living wage and be able to work in a way that supports themselves and their families. It's because of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and all of the people who worked alongside him, who loved Jesus and were transformed by relationships with Jesus, that the civil rights movement continued on through the 60s, and we continue to do the work today because we still haven't quite gotten it right. It's because of Jesus that we have organizations like the Reconciling Ministries Network, who work to bring dignity and love and inclusion for those who are LGBTQ in our churches and in our world around us. We do the work of justice because that's the fruit of our connection to Jesus. It's not easy, but it's the work we're called to do. Mishpat and Zedek, justice and righteousness. They go together because that's how the vine was always supposed to produce its fruit. And if you're wondering what that looks like for you, if you're wondering how you work into that, a good place to start is just to read the Bible. Read the stories of Jesus. And if you want to read a particular part of that, read the Gospel of John. We're doing a sermon series reflecting on the I am statements. Start reading John. It's not the shortest of the Gospels, but it's one of them. And see what Jesus did. See who Jesus talked to. See how Jesus related to people. Just to give you a few examples, there was a woman who was caught in adultery. Again, where's the dude? If you're caught in adultery, there's two people tangoing there. But the woman was brought before people and she was put on death row because the people wanted to kill her with stones. And Jesus said, hey, whichever one of you is without sin, you get to cast the first stone. And as I read that story, I hear the stones thud into the ground as people are leaving because none of them are perfect. And therefore, none of them can condemn her. I think about Jesus in the story of when he sat down and befriended and talked with a woman, a Samaritan woman, and broke all the social taboos. When he told the story about the Samaritan man who was the hero in the story and the priest and the Levite were not. How Jesus sat and ate with tax collectors and sinners, the people who were ostracized that he was told he wasn't supposed to hang out with. He hung out with them anyway because God loved them and he gave them dignity and respect. If you read the stories of Jesus, you begin to see what justice and goodness look like. And then you can begin to do those things. Invite the band back up. Well, Joey and Mike. And as they're making their way up here, I want to give you a few practical things that might be places where you can start to work for justice and goodness in our world. One of those is you can work with our Lakeland County, whatever county you're in, supervisor of elections, and work for voter registration. Enable people to use the voice that God has given them so that they can cast a vote. It's simple, but it is a place of bringing dignity and respect to be able to do this. And if that's not your bag, maybe you'd rather work as a tutor and help tutor young people. Our local elementary school, FPE, needs tutors. And our tutoring program needs to be restarted. And if you want to be a part of that, talk to me or talk to Faye, and we'll see what we can do to help make that happen. And if you don't like the littles in the elementary school, then maybe you can tutor our middle schoolers at Carver Middle School or at Leesburg High. They're not as cute sometimes, but they're just as beloved by God. And they still need tutors too. Maybe those aren't things that you can really get on board with. I promise you that there is a justice thing that you can get involved with. Whatever it is, wherever it is, come talk to me and I'll help you figure it out. Because brothers and sisters, to the degree that we are connected to Jesus and doing the things Jesus did, we will bear much fruit. Life isn't just about living. It's about living to the fullest and bearing much fruit for the glory of God, transforming this world as we are connected to the one who transformed it and formed it. And when we do these things, God is glorified. And we bear the fruit that we were always created to bear as the people of God. So my friends, go and bear much fruit. Mishpat and Zedek, justice and righteousness, so that the world may know and love the God who has created them, as you know and love the God who has created you.